will try to share the screen. Hope it will work. Okay, here we are. So yes, I decided to focus this lecture or presentation on public relation films for export, which was part of my research interest while researching advertising, Czechoslovak advertising in the previous project. And for this, I will need to guide you through what public relations was, what was its position in the Czechoslovak advertising, and then I will focus on films specifically. So in early 1967, two friends, students at the University of Economics in Prague and adjuncts to the RAPID, Foreign Trade Advertising Agency of Czechoslovakia, Jiří Mikeš and Ladislav Kopecký, made a study trip of their lives. Thanks to the opportunity that RAPID gave its student assistants, they traveled abroad for 3 months and received a fellowship at the Institute of Public Relations and at the Alfred Pemberton's Advertising Agency in London, UK. Retrospectively, Mikeš described this experience partly as living in London with £50 he received in Czechoslovakia for the entire stay, partly as intensive networking. The fact is that together with Kopecký, he was able to take advantage of this unique opportunity to an unprecedented extent and turn it into a career lift in both socialist and post-socialist advertising. In the 1970s and 80s, when Czechoslovakia still had a centralized structure of a nationalized socialist economy without a free market, Mikeš became a prominent figure in a national advertising agency, Merkur, and dealt with contracts for the Government Committee for Tourism. Kopecký became one of the key figures in foreign promotion of Czechoslovakia. They both then operatively used their experience and contacts from abroad, even after 1989, when the communist regime collapsed and Western advertising agencies headed for Czechoslovakia established their branches in Prague and looked for people with appropriate experience. At the end of the 1960s, however, their trip to the UK had not only personal but also more general meaning in the discourse on advertising in Czechoslovakia, because it has contributed to a paradigm shift in thinking about the need to better know the customers, the consumers, the public, in the field of advertising, marketing, and public relations. Public relations history has typically been written from the perspective of the development of corporate PR agencies in the United States. But as Jackie Etang notes, I quote, public relation histories can be national, regional, cultural, governmental, institutional, organizational, professional, biographical, and autobiographical, unquote. It is by taking into account the specificities of national intellectual traditions, particular political and socio-economic conditions, and the particular historical situation in international relations, that we can observe the plurality of public relations practices across different contexts. In the case of state socialist countries, it should be emphasized, given the different economic arrangements, that public relations developed there less as a profession and more as a practice. Since the debate on the broad or narrow meaning of public relations is its definitional delineation and overlaps with other types of communication and management, especially propaganda, advertising, and marketing, is still alive among theorists and historians of public relations, historicizing the field in specific contexts allows us to uncover the specific intellectual underpinnings that shape the concept of public relations and specifically adapted it to local conditions. In this presentation, I draw from how the concept of public relations itself emerged and settled in the Czechoslovak discourse. I would like to point out that public relations in state socialist Czechoslovakia did not find its anchorage as a distinct type of profession, but as I said, was cultivated in the texts and praxis of press personalities coming from the expert framework of advertising, foreign trade, sociology, and psychology. It was this background that also significantly shaped the concept, meaning, and form of this field in Czechoslovakia in the 70s and 80s, and primarily helped to establish a specific format of so-called public relations film, which is really a discursive term, which shaped Czechoslovakia's business image abroad. The concept of public relations was presented in Czechoslovakia as a kind of adaptation of British practices to the socialist environment. A few months after their return, in May 1967, Jiří Mikeš and Ladislav Kopecký took advantage of their newly acquired contacts in London and favorable geopolitical situation, and organized a week of British advertising in Prague, to which they invited British experts to present their vision of advertising and public relations to Czechoslovak advertising professionals through lectures and, importantly, also film screenings. This event even then became a formative moment of anchoring the theories of public relations in Czechoslovakia, where so far this connection has appeared rather marginally. And as we will see, film has been an integral part in this process from the very beginning. In 1967 and 1968, public relations experienced an unprecedented boom on the pages of the key professional periodical called Propagace. The translation of the lecture by Pemberton's public relations officer in charge, Stephen Daines, called What is and What is Not Public Relations, was reprinted, which Mikeš and Kopecký followed up with a series of their own articles on this topic. Yet other steps followed. The Institute for the Study of Public Opinion Research at the Academy of Sciences was founded in 1968, and in 1969, the first Czech book publication, and at the same time, the textbook Public Relations in Marketing by Alfons Kakík was published. This specific integration of British influences into socialist advertising discourse also occurred at a specific moment in Czechoslovak post-war history. It was in 1967 that Czechoslovakia was perhaps the most open to the West of its entire state socialist era. Around the mid-1960s, we can speak of a certain liberalization of conditions in Czechoslovakia, manifested, among other things, by a greater openness to influences from outside the Soviet bloc. This meant the transfer of knowledge and experience both in science and in culture and art. Thus, Czechoslovak economists began to rethink the question of the market in the state socialist system and to prepare economic reforms. There was a renewed interest in social sciences, such as sociology and psychology. And in the field of advertising and promotion, there was a new effort to define the specifics of marketing and public relations. In connection with these changes, Czechoslovak foreign trade strategies were also changing. Experts defining public relations have often defined the discipline in contrast to marketing, pointing to the difference with the key era of interest. While marketing, they argued, was centered around the complex product concept, public relations was based on an interest in the public, in the persons. Even in the context of this division, the centrally planned economic structure of state socialist Czechoslovakia developed knowledge about these two partially interrelated areas separately. While the field of marketing as a specific area developing production and comprehensively grasping the product from its development through production, packaging, promotion, and pricing based on the knowledge of demand was perceived as part of corporate management and as such was the domain of economists, and institutionally as the Czechoslovak Chamber of Commerce was mainly responsible for the development of this type of knowledge, published in a specialized M edition. In the case of public relations, it was a knowledge linked to market psychology research and much more intertwined with advertising institutions. Patrick Heider-Peterson sees the development of PR and marketing in the second half of the 1960s in Czechoslovakia as a short-lived boom that was substantially curtailed during the period of so-called normalization. Specifically from 1972 onwards, according to Peterson, this type of thinking completely disappeared from Czechoslovak discourse and, in his opinion, did not fully take root in Czech economic and market managerial thinking even in the 1990s. Denisa Hejlová also perceives the period of normalization in the traditional spirit of consolidation of ideological supervision over all spheres of activity and perceives continuity only in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when she points out the importance of student international initiatives for the development of education and contacts of the new generation of PR experts who fully established themselves after the fall of communism. I, on the other hand, would like to demonstrate a longer-term continuity in thinking about public relations across the normalization era, which was sustained abroad in the field of film promotion through Ladislav Kopecký and the Department of Public Relations in RAPID, and an influential group of psychologists and of consumption and advertising. For Mikeš and Kopecký, the importance of public relations concepts in socialist promotion lay primarily in emphasizing the word public, in Czech veřejnost. In an article aptly titled Zatracená veřejnost, done public, they mapped the American tradition of this concept and at the same time described public involvement in the advertising activities of Czechoslovak agencies as insufficient and called for a return to the consistently informed public. Although they made no explicit comparison between capitalist and socialist PR in their text, they implicitly pointed out the difference by defining the term done public as the reason for the birth of PR in the US. In doing so, they emphasized the defensive purpose of PR as a tool with which industrial conglomerates have sought to deflect public criticism since the late 19th century. Their definition of PR was very general and directed towards the need, I quote, to interpret the public's attitude to the client, to advise him in his actions, and to explain his policy to all sections of the public with which he comes into contact in his activities and on which he depends. The client here, unquote, and the client here wasn't a customer, but some company which was commissioning the PR services. In this context, concept of an informed public was consistent with the rationalizing, educating, and cultivating mission of socialist advertising, and at the same time, it could help to improve it. According to Ladislav Kopecký, the problem of socialist promotion in general lay in the fact that, in view of the structural economic conditions, it was formed as part of an, I quote Kopecký, administrative directive sales system, unquote. By this, Kopecký meant the significant subordination of advertising to sales institutions, which in Czechoslovakia had much larger budgets for promotion than production companies. In the early 1970s, 85% of foreign advertising was provided by enterprises authorized to trade abroad. It was the so-called Organizace zahraničního obchodu, foreign trade organizations. This systemic setup dictated promotion to the distribution units, the trade, and thus significantly influenced what would be promoted and in what ways. Kopecký also complained that the field of distribution is too influenced by technocratic thinking and completely ignored the creative aspects of promotion. He called this problem the RUR complex, which, according to him, was at the root of the problems related to the management of the consumer cycle in socialist Czechoslovakia. Kopecký used the term RUR to refer to the classic of Czech science fiction literature, Karel Čapek, and his eponymous work, where the RUR stands for Rassum's Universal Robots, which gave the world the word robot in the 1930s. Čapek's Universal Robots were at the starting point for dramatic reflections of the limits of humanity, the enrichments of and pitfalls of human-machine relations, and the critique of the one-sided perception of the mechanic nature of science as a self-sustaining means of progress. It was the myopia of the dazzle of the results of scientific research and the necessity to use the term creatively and thoughtfully that Kopecký pointed out through the term RUR complex in his reflections. Sales professionals, he claimed, I quote, use the results of surveys and research like a drunkard uses a street lamp, as a prop rather than a tool of illumination, unquote. Grounded in the environment of advertising as a creative industry, Kopecký perceived the enthusiasm for the scientific technical revolution in state socialism as short-sighted and called for a more consistent application of research results in creative concepts of communication with consumers. the problem of insufficient applications of the survey results into practice, and the unwillingness to revise the concept of consumption in Czechoslovakia proved to be crucial in the following 20 years. Kopecký's RUR complex thus referred to a specific state of limbo in which state socialism accumulates theoretical knowledge, but is unable to apply it strategically to increase the consumption satisfaction of the population. Mikeš's and Kopecký's translation of public relations concepts into socialist conditions had a background in sociology and psychology, and its emphasis on the aspect of external relations and communication with the public. For them, public relations were a way to overcome the RUR complex in the advertising industry and to discover the concept of the customer as a consumer for socialist consumer communication. Their thinking was thus related to the parallel development of research on consumer behavior and purchase motivations, and developed into the distinct expertise and research orientation of the advertising industry in the second half of the 1960s. Sociology and psychology experienced the Renaissance in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s after their decline in the Stalinist period, and both in teaching at universities and in research, they began to penetrate into applied areas such as advertising and marketing. At the same time, it is important to mention that the very term public relations experienced its greatest glory in the first half of the year 1968, the period of social and economic liberalization of the Prague Spring, but later, when the liberalization tendencies in Czechoslovakia were stopped by Soviet occupation and the country's normalization of political conditions, it slowly disappeared from the discourse. However, as I want to argue, it did not disappear completely. It was not a fixed part of the vocabulary of advertising experts, but interest in the consumer public continued to be cultivated in theoretical concepts, research, and practice, especially for foreign promotion of Czechoslovakia, which also gave birth to a specific genre or category of so-called public relations films. In addition to the theoretical anchoring of interest in the public and ways of addressing it in the research and on consumer behavior and theories of consumer communication, the concept of public relations had taken hold on a practical level in film production. Moreover, the link between film production and public relations in the 1970s and 80s was de facto institutionalized through a festival of foreign trade advertising films that the Soviet satellite countries held in Varna, a beach resort in Bulgaria. For advertising film professionals, such festivals were an important platform for meeting and exchanging contacts, but also for sharing experiences, plans, and inspiration. From the late 1950s and during the 1960s, Czechoslovak filmmakers participated in the traditional events of this type in Cannes and in Venice, but they were rarely able to show their films in the competition section. By participating in these festivals, they tended to keep in touch with the world trends, which they also regularly reported on in advertising magazines. However, the health of liberalization trends in the 60s, with the invasion of the Warsaw Pact troops, turned Czechoslovakia back more, though not exclusively, to the Eastern Bloc world of ideas. The Varna Advertising Film Festival was a response by Eastern European professionals to these changes and an effort to organize within the region with a specific strategic focus on foreign trade promotion. It was held for the first time in October 1973, and from 1975 onwards, regularly included a competition category for so-called public relations films, which complemented two other categories distinguished only the film length, the section of films under 3 minutes and the section of films 3 to 26 minutes long. Signaling out the category of public relations film as a specific section demonstrates the importance that was attributed to this type of production in foreign trade communication in the Eastern Bloc countries. This seemingly simple division had its justification with regard to the distribution target of foreign promotional films, from which the functions and themes of the films were also derived. The shortest films were generally about consumer goods and were intended for cinemas and television broadcasting. The category of longer films included most technical films for professionals, presented usually at industrial fairs. Films within the public relations category were often labeled as so-called prestige films and were expected to have both informational and high artistic value. Czechoslovakia was the country that submitted the least number of films in 1973, but more than 26 of them were awarded. Ladislav Kopecký, as a key representative of Rapid at the festival, considered this result as a proof of Czechoslovak efficiency and pointed out that Czechoslovak collection was successful precisely with regard to the artistic aspects of the films, while in the category of effective shorts, it is far behind other countries. It is important to underline here that the Eastern Bloc countries have anchored the category of public relations films exclusively in the field of foreign trade promotion. They perceive the function of building a good image of a company or brand externally as essential for foreign business partners, not for domestic consumers. The area of advertising for the foreign market partly declared resistance. As I indicated at the beginning, Jiří Mikeš and Ladislav Kopecký became important personalities regulating this area. Mikeš worked on advertisements for the Government Committee for Tourism and thus focused on the promotion of Czechoslovakia as a tourist destination abroad. In order to increase the prestige of this industry, Mikeš and his colleagues funded another international festival of films promoting tourism. It was called Turfilm, which has been taking place regularly in Karlovy Vary since the late 1960s. At the Rapid agency, Ladislav Kopecký was in charge of promoting Czechoslovakian brands abroad, and from this position he coined the concept of so-called public relations film. Kopecky's attitude to advertising on foreign markets was based on the basic economic premise, which was the high price for broadcasting advertising on television. Therefore, he completely rejected television as a distribution channel for Czechoslovak foreign advertising and focused solely on screenings at exhibition, fairs, and other shows for trade and commerce. It is with regard to these specific distribution environments and the public that visits them that Czechoslovak foreign advertisements were also to be produced. Kopecky's public relations was to be addressed primarily to foreign sales representatives. In the centralized system of the Czechoslovak economy, there were only a few specific brands that could act abroad exclusively for themselves. For example, Škoda, Jablonex, and so on. But much more frequent was the representation of certain sectors by so-called foreign trade organizations. Such were, for example, Sklo-Export, exporting glass, Centrotex, exporting textile, or Koospol, exporting agricultural production, in whose films the focus on trade fairs and addressing sales representatives was clearly reflected. Czechoslovakia generally produced three types of public relations films. The first were documentary films with high artistic values, most often promoting famous Czech glasswork. The second line of foreign public relations promotion was represented by documentary films underlying the atmosphere of corporate activities for foreign business partners. Thirdly, films with a framing fiction plot, often based on a genre mix of comedy and film about industrial espionage. Although these three categories may seem very different from a formal point of view, they share similar appeals to the target audience, which in the case of public relations, films was supposed to be a foreign sales agents or representatives who might be willing to do business with Czechoslovak goods. Czech glassmaking has a very long tradition and has always been in demand on foreign markets and was one of the key priority areas of Czechoslovak exports outside the traditional engineering sectors. Therefore, its representation for commercial purposes, whether in the form of photographs or even more often specific publications, was given great attention in the form of specialized magazines like, for example, Czechoslovak Glass Review, and catalogs with sophisticated graphic design. Glass was photographed by the most important Czech photographers, and for many of them, such as Jindřich Brock, it became a lifelong theme and source of commissions. The transparency of glass was a challenge for photographers and meant the necessity to experiment, to come up with unconventional solutions in composition and arrangement, to emphasize shape, color, and other aspects of the goods in an artistic way. Even in film, the presentation of Czech glass had a long tradition and was actively continued in public relations in the 1970s. The poetic expression using the rounded shapes of glass was creatively used by Karel Zeman in 1948 when he moved glass figures in the film Inspirace, Inspiration. Here Zeman foregrounds the trick possibilities of the film without referring to the figures as commodities and highlighting any of their qualities. Nevertheless, the film served as an artistic celebration of Czech glassmaking and as such also established a tradition of foreign film promotion in glass export. In the 1960s, this trend was followed by the films Concerto Classico by Ladislav Richman and Bohemian Glass Rhapsody by Christian Topic, which were then referred to in the 1970s and 80s as the ideals of glass public relations. In both, classical music played an important role, emphasizing the impression of luxury associated with situation in which people use glass, typically visits to restaurants, bars, or theaters with huge crystal chandeliers. Films promoting glass abroad won Czechoslovakia awards at Varna Film Festival in 1974, 1976, and even in 1978. While in other categories, Czechoslovak films did not place at all, in the category of public relations, they won awards repeatedly. In particular, The Story of the Seven Guildmasters by Dušan Trančík from 1973, Bijou Show by Pavel Kaňka, or Concerto Bohemo by Christian Topic and Crystal Sun, Glass Variations, all referred to the artistic values of glass. In the case of The Story of the Seven Guildmasters, combined with references to fine art and Rembrandt imagery, in others with musical classicism. The artistic promotion of glass carried the message of craftsmanship and beauty of Czech products and corresponded to the long-established national image of Czech manual dexterity. Documentary public relation films often thematize the social situations of various business meetings, negotiations, banquets, and the like. In some cases, these films showed such events for business partners as a tourist and at the same time gastronomic experience, a relaxing trip full of delicacies and alcohol, and used various film techniques to make the beauty of Czech glass visible in a second plan, when bartenders prepared drinks and guests drank them from fancy glasses, and these drinks obviously being Becherovka and others. This type of films were more typical of the second half of the 1960s, when public relations awareness was still developing in Czechoslovakia. In the 1970s and 80s, the function of these films was taken over by more traditionally conceived reportage films from exhibition fairs, or, for example, Centrotex fashion shows. Kospol then co-produced industrial films that worked with a split-screen principle and gave the viewer a basic insight into Kospol's product range and production background. Thus, during the period of late socialism, this type of film weakened its emphasis on selling pleasure and luxury to foreign partners in favor of information and documentary. Fictional public relation films were used, for example, by Kospol and combined stylistic or genre conventions of thriller, crime film, comedy, spy drama, sometimes also with documentary elements. In the case of the film Kospol from 1975, a dignified sales representative, played by the well-known comedic actor Petr Nárožný, arrives in Prague on a Lufthansa plane, evoking his coming from the West. Nárožný was known for his rather serious, often confused or choleric character types, and it was his ability to portray confusion physically, without words, that very well served for international public relations. In the film, his character enters the Kospol building, a new, very presentable building built in the brutalist style of the 1970s, where he gets lost in the intricate corridors. As he opens new doors, the world of Czechoslovakian agriculture is opened up to him through film editing. Thanks to this spatial trick, Nárožný leaves the building corridors and goes sometimes into the fields, sometimes to farms, directly to the production, where he has a chance to get a first-hand insight into the cultivation and breeding, as well as processing of raw materials into food products, returns back into the building, and the next door takes part in tastings of Czechoslovak gastronomy. In this way, the film combines public relations with industrial film and fictional plot, and tries to refresh the promotional communication with genre hybridity. Other gospel films are based on a similar principle, using various genre conventions, usually sci-fi or thriller, in comedic exaggeration. In Gospel Ltd. From 1985, a visitor from outer space, played by actor Karel Augusta, arrives in Czechoslovakia and accidentally exchanges a suitcase with a Czech business traveler. Thanks to this exchange, the Czech trader finds futuristic performance-enhancing candies in his new suitcase to hand out to Czech workers. And the space trader, Augusta, gets to know the Czech countryside, especially agriculture, and admires the local hospitality. And I'd like to show you a clip, if it will work. Hopefully it will, because it's a good thing to share.
You have to share sound, I think, as well. It's on Zoom. Or you should. You turn up the volume, but you have to, on Zoom, you have to, you share? You have to choose. Oh,
Yeah,
it's okay.
it's okay. It should be okay, but I don't know if I am muted, how we can hear the sound here.
Oh, here.
Here, but
Okay, nobody speak. No, I don't know, actually.
Maybe you can unmute that and then turn on the mic.
So I hope the sound worked for the audience. But as you could see, the film in its entirety has about 20 minutes. This was about 5 minutes long clip from the very beginning, where you could see the frame of the film with these two businessmen exchanging suitcases, using specific magical devices like the watch, through which the Augusta character he used it to see through the glass and to see how the industrial production with Becherovka works. And the second magical device was those candies, which really helped people to work more efficiently and helped Kospol to work more efficiently in general. Another example of this very similar kind of using generic genres or stylistic framing and plot tools was in the film Where is the Recipe from 1985, where again two businessmen are drinking Czech liquor Becherovka in a bar, which they like so much that they try to break into the factory and find the recipe. Their harrowing search ultimately serves as an excursion into the history of the Czechoslovak distilling industry, but in the end they are caught and arrested by the police. The plots of all these films show that alongside more traditionally oriented industrial films like documentary ones, Kospol tried to directly address a specific audience group, namely the sales representatives, through a mix of genres and by creating the impression of a kind of exaggerated identification. These films attempted to approach sales representatives in a humorous way and win their attention and favor through it. Alfons Kachtík, the publisher of the first comprehensive publication on public relations in Czechoslovakia, which was published already in 1969, defined foreign trade as a key sphere of activity in this sector, specifically because brand or product awareness and familiarity are logically lower abroad than in the country of origin and need to be built up more diligently. An essential aspect of his reflections on the role of public relations in foreign trade towards Western countries was the mistrust that both end consumers and direct business partners might have towards a socialist country. He believed that they might prejudicially associate its products and services with unreliability and inferior quality. His logic of public relations in foreign trade was thus implicitly based on overcoming these psychological barriers, overcoming this distrust, and creating an impression of closeness. At the same time, he argued that countries that have a negative image in other countries for ideological reasons, such as socialist Czechoslovakia, must first create positive economic PR and then build on that while creating positive political PR. According to Kachlik, economic PR was therefore the basis for establishing an image of national identity abroad. The Czechoslovak public relation films met this premise in a twofold way of building closeness. First of all, especially in the field of glass, they tried to attract attention with their artistic and luxury appeal, thus overcome the notion of the country's cultural and creative backwardness. In the second, they deliberately worked with documentary and fictional situation of encounters and visits as initiating moments of bonding and creating a fellow feeling. While distance is seen by psychology as based on differentiation, closeness, on the other hand, is based on similarity, familiarity, and sharing, including, for example, the sharing of humorous experience. Situations of business representatives meeting on trips and surrounded by Czech gastronomy depicted in documentary films created a sense of notion and attention. Similarly, fictional films were supposed to overcome the initial barrier of ignorance with humorous exaggeration. At the same time, it is interesting that the impression of closeness and familiarity here was not personal, represented by a specific person, but by the space of the Kospol building, presented as a gateway to the world of Czechoslovak agriculture and gastronomic togetherness. In this context, the sales agent remained to a large extent an observing foreigner, not losing his original identity, but as an explorer, getting acquainted with Czech industry, agriculture, and hospitality, and thus getting closer to the local culture. Public relations, and I'm now concluding my talk, public relations experienced an unprecedented boom in an inopportune time in socialist Czechoslovakia. Its wider development and application, and eventually its specific translation into the socialist environment, was fully halted by the political changes after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. However, although public relations did not develop as a specialized profession in the next 20 years, the influence of its concepts did not fully disappear from the thinking, discourse, and practice of public relations practitioners of the time. The premise of creating a brand image and strategically addressing different groups of the public was further developed by experts in psychology, sociology, and economics, who, with support in various specific market and consumer demand research, anchored public and consumer interest in marketing theory, and also suggested specific possible applications in various media, including film. However, application in practice in the internal market remained problematic, linked to the structural problems of the advertising industry and, above all, cuts in advertising budgets following the oil crisis in the late 1970s. Besides more detailed study of customers as consumers, including surveys of consumer needs and purchasing motivations, experts began to pay special attention to public relations practices in outward communication, promotion of foreign trade. Perhaps surprisingly, though, socialist Czechoslovakia most focused on cultivating the image of its industry abroad, trying to overcome the RUR complex of the Czech advertising industry and use new research inputs in practice. As this presentation was to show, films occupied a special place in these efforts. In film promotional production, even with the institutional anchoring of a distinct category at the Varna Film festival,
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
a distinct format of so-called public relations film emerged, which was generally intended to promote good relations with business partners and inform them about the products and on offer. In Czechoslovakia, such goodwill films were usually commissioned by the so-called foreign trained enterprises, the export enterprises, and rather than presenting specific products, they concentrated on conveying a general positive impression of what Czechoslovakia had to offer abroad. A key strategy of these films was to create an impression of closeness to Czechoslovak exports in general, through the positive values of high art culture, personal encounters, and unique gastronomic experiences. These practices were not aimed at developing relations with consumers, but at strengthening the impression of quality, craftsmanship, artistry, and playfulness as a key selling points of Czechoslovakia abroad. In an internal trade, on the other hand, Czechoslovak socialist advertising did not return to Dan public until the perestroika period, in the late 1980s, which paved the way for the rapid expansion of the advertising industry and its theoretically equipped socialist experts in the post-socialist 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a ton of questions as usual. Well, first of all, thank you for the wonderful extract, which was quite a thing indeed. What impressed me the most, I think it was if you had to retell what was going on. I know we only watched an extract, but still it was just pure vibes, not a plot, not quite a I don't know, not even a selling strategy behind it. This is what actually prompts and what kind of echoes my first and biggest question, the elephant in the room for me is the term itself, because public relations film, you would expect it to be an advertising film or an ad simply, but public relations, you would expect somebody to just show up and talk to an audience. You do not expect the anything commercial behind it necessarily. So would you say it was, well, first of all, is it your impression as well? And would you say it comes from this whole Soviet model of doing foreign trade mostly, well, as much for prestige and for the image, as well as just for business purposes?
Yeah, I mean, there are two different things because first of all, they really differentiate between what is advertising and what is public relations.
Mm-hmm.
And these films were intended to be those called public relations films that are not about really selling things in this explicit way, but about creating some goodwill between the foreign customers, which were sales representatives mostly because they were using these films on those industrial fairs, for example. For me, it was quite interesting to even find out this category at all existed, and that it had this distinctive position in the whole production, because they really did some other advertisements much shorter, which were more brand oriented, and for those brands that were somehow recognized by the at the foreign markets, which were mostly Škoda and the Jablonex. These were two, and Barum maybe
What is Jablonex?
Jablonex are bijou jewelry, basically. Yes. And these two were quite. They have other strategies. They were really selling new models. For example, Škoda developed something new, so they were really showing even for Škoda, for example, the production, 70% of production of Škoda was for export. It was only 30% of production of Škoda that were used to be for domestic customers. So these brands were really brands. They still had this image throughout the state socialist era, but others for example, Becherovka was not considered as such like a big brand, and they were sold more or less like by Kospol, that company that was focusing on the agricultural production, and together with other alcoholic beverages, with beer, for example, but with other Czech agricultural products. For this, for the very reason which was in a way really tied to how the Czechoslovak economy and the exports worked, that it was not the production companies that were selling it. It was these podniky zahraničního obchodu, these export companies that were selling it, and that were not focusing that much on specific brands, but on the whole offer that Czechoslovakia in this area could give to its foreign customers. And for this reason, they probably focused more on these goodwill public relations films than on brand advertising that would sell. And the second reason would be the thing I've mentioned in the last minutes, was the idea that probably there is some prejudice of the Western sales representatives, that the socialist Czechoslovakia would sell them something that is not quite good. And we even saw it represented in the film when he was like smelling the Becherovka, and he wasn't sure what is it here that they are offering him. So he used this watch to analyze how it is produced. So even like the film even somehow like reflexively reflects the situation of some prejudice, and the sales representative is not so sure what he is going to get. They were probably like trying to show this way of hospitality. Like this is many films of the public relations are about the hospitality, about what Czech gastronomy could offer them, how and they are drinking it from those big glasses, drinking alcohol and enjoying the meetings and so on. So it's about like this good atmosphere of encounter and of overcoming some barriers that may be there for these sales representatives. And I don't know, it's something that is, of course, like not written anywhere. You can read it only from those films. But for me, like when I was trying to somehow like understand what this is about, because it's something really, it's not a typical thing you are analyzing. It's like it's not typical fictional film. For me, this was the key. How can I explain why these films looked like this? And as you said, it doesn't have a typical plot, but there is some framing plot, because they always like, it's somehow like a journey through the Czech land. It's a journey through various fields of Czech agriculture, maybe, or industry sometimes. And there is always this framing of like sales representatives comes to Czechoslovakia, mostly to Prague, of course. And also Czechoslovak airlines are very much into this image of like making bridges between Czechoslovakia and the Western world.
Actually, you mentioned Prague. I just thought about another question. Is there a difference between Czech and Slovak production, or is it a pure capital city phenomenon?
Actually, like in terms of production, these films that we saw were mostly produced by Krátký film, short film, which at the time wasn't the only producer, because those agencies, those advertising agencies, they also had their film studios. But importantly, for these kinds of films, they used commissions from the Czechoslovak short film. primarily because it was connected again with those artistic values. Yeah, the filmmakers connected to short film were thought as these are the filmmakers, while Mercury has only some amateurs that are doing some lower values with films. And in Slovakia and the Slovak part of Czechoslovakia, there was it was mostly produced by ERPO, which was a Slovak advertising agency, and some of these films were also produced at Koliba by filmmakers there. Interestingly, you saw that there was Trančík's films on glass, for example. So there were some people from the new wave filmmakers that were involved. And with one specific exception that couldn't pass my typology, which was Juraj Jakubisko. And I saw his films only in the Slovak Film Institute. And these are really, really super hybrid films in which blonde Slovak girls in folk costumes are posing with washing machines in the countryside, under the Tatra mountains, and so on. So it was this kind of really surreal imagery of Jakubisko that met with advertising and with public relations. He did it for Omnia. Omnia was something like again like export agency for these electro products like washing machines and so on. And these are really, really bizarre films, I have to say. And yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to use it in any way because of the rights. But yeah, I would love to screen it someday.
Yes, yeah, because you mentioned there would be famous actors who would take part in it, but also during the normalization, you would wonder with so many artists and filmmakers leaving for example, for kids cinema, would they go into ad cinema?
That's interesting because for Slovak, it's the case. Jakubisko and Trančík probably like spent a few years like doing things like this, like in the early 1970s, and then they were allowed to do again like fictional films. I heard, but I didn't find any evidence that Chytilová did something in the early 1970s, some advertisements for brass, which I would love to see as well, but I haven't seen it, and there is no like written evidence about it at all, and I didn't find anything about this. But she is probably the only a new wave filmmaker I heard of, because for some reasons there was Ladislav Richman that he did advertisements in the 60s mostly, but he wasn't the kind of filmmaker that would have these problems at the beginning of the 70s. So I don't know about any Czech artistic filmmaker from the 60s that would have this position and used this field as somehow like the transitory field for but it's obvious question I would like to learn more about, but this is what I know.
And actually something that we've discussed during the previous meeting with Jonathan Owen, how those artists would kind of enter the field of, say, burlesque comedy and sabotage it from the inside. So with this example you're given of Jakubisko's artwork, maybe it was also the case to push it to the most extreme thing.
Yeah, it was like really like the extreme imagery you would even imagine. It was like but I would like to also add that with advertising and with these films, sometimes it's very difficult to even find the author. Sometimes you don't have the titles exactly, so you don't even know who was the director. The sources are very scarce, and it's partly because of short films archive is not here anymore, and partly because this kind of production wasn't catalogued even at that time, because it wasn't for the official distribution, because at the time they mostly catalogued films that entered the official distribution, like documentaries and so on. But these films that were mostly done like as a commission for these export organizations and so on, they are not cataloging it. And the archives of these export organizations are unprocessed right now, so you can't go into there and find out something. It may be the source, like all these export organizations, but in the National Archives you can't go there and edit. It's not.
Would festivals have any database? Because it was interesting. I didn't know there was the Varna Festival, which is just, I imagine the joy people and the bewilderment it would generate in the public. Yeah, and like, would they have some kind of archive of their own?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't. I didn't ask. Because I don't have any connections so far in Bulgaria, for example, so that I could probably like ask about the Varna Film Festival. But I'm going there in June, so
that sounds like an absolutely exciting and very fresh, actually, kind of page for the whole 70s, 80s image.
I'm always like wondering how like Kopecky, who was traveling to Cannes till 1968, now he had to go to Varna to the Golden Sands, Zlaté and have even the idea of the advertising film festival on the beach there is really fascinating, and there should be some archive about like of the festival, but all these kinds of non-fiction films, because I mentioned even the tour film, it's again like it's a different category for me, at least, because it was a festival of tourist films of socialist countries that were showing like really the imagery of and the beauty of the countryside mostly, and these films are really repetitive. You always see the same castles, the same mountains, and the same things people could do there, and why they could do it there. But it had its own festival. Again, like these people were joining this group of practitioners and sharing films and screening them in Karlovy Vary for the whole 20 years here. So it was from the 70s to 80s. And there were other specialized festivals of these kinds of films.
This is very interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience here or on Zoom?
Well, I would like to ask you a question. How much was it different from what was done at the time in public relations in other European countries, well, especially in Western European countries? How much was it different?
Yeah, this is something I basically don't know a lot about, because it's not a very well researched area. Even like about advertising, you wouldn't find. What is researched is the US. But obviously, the most important markets for Czechoslovakia were Western European markets. They very much focused on Germany as a traditional partner for trade, but also France and others. To know more about how these kinds of films looked like, it's because of their archival status and really like ephemeral nature. There is not much research done about these films, so it's very problematic to compare it for me.
Actually, to stay in the regional dimension, my question would be, to come back to the Varna Festival as well. You mentioned that multiple countries throughout the Soviet bloc would participate. Was there, and given we're in the 70s, and like mid-70s, the offensive normalization period for Czechoslovakia and the Brezhnev era in the Soviet Union in particular, was there any kind of Moscow-led supervision? Was there any vertical structure to the whole?
Yeah, this is something
field?
I also am not so sure about because again, like what I know is that advertising in the Czechoslovakia was somehow quite independent on what the Moscow would say. They, of course, used this broad concept of what is socialist advertising, and they were repeating it a lot. But they also tried to somehow like differentiate, and it was basically because even like you can find it from the in the period press, the magazine Propagace, they treated the Soviet advertising as like less artistic than the Czechoslovak one, and also like again like not the greatest example of what could be done, and they were quite open about it in their writings, and yeah, so it's very interesting to see that they were trying always to differentiate because the Czech industry is different, the Czech and its image should be also a little bit different, and we can't use the same strategies as Soviets, for example, and with the artistic thing, because they really, even when you read sometimes the magazine Propagace also reprinted some foreign reactions to Czech films and Czech advertising in general, and the notion of artistry was always there as something that is distinguishes Czechoslovak advertising. But not always in the best sense, yeah, because again, like it was these eras where the selling, sometimes you are not selling while doing art, basically, and it was sometimes it was perceived as a weakness, and sometimes it was perceived as a strength or some or distinctive feature of Czech advertising. And for public relations, it was probably the field where the artistry find its place in the end, because it wasn't, as I said, not something that should like strictly sell, but just to create the image and the brand of national brand more than probably like the production or industrial brand.
Yeah, and especially if you take into consideration that those films are screened during expos, international fairs, like we know many Czechoslovak examples of very avant-garde content, but also technologies like Laterna Magica, like the interactive film, they all reach the viewer.
Exactly, and for this, they even like the Czechoslovakia somehow perceive it is again like something we are good at, like because for expos they even the Arts Centrum, they were even like getting commissions from abroad to sell these technologies or to create new content for polyekran. For example, polyekran was something that was really well known abroad, and they were using it for various exhibitions, both for business purposes, but as well for some more like educational purposes, because sometimes they were more telling people about the history, for example, of something. And I remember really commissions from Germany and commissions even from Arab countries for polyekran and these multi-screen technologies for exhibition purposes in the 70s and 80s. And it's a very important context of how the people in these foreign trade and advertising positions were thinking of what is the strength of Czech artists and audiovisual artists, we can say, because it was not only about film but also about these technologies behind.
And I think it is still very modern to this day, even the approach, like the hybrid approach to both content and the technology behind it, which always go together. And be it an ad film, be it cinema for theater, as we have in Laterna Magica, which is very early. And I think it is very interesting how both shape and content are taken into consideration. Do we have questions from the viewers? Yes, please.
Thank you, Lucia, for the interesting lecture. I'm Larissa Naumova from UDU. I want to ask, I think it's very specific films. Can you say about some influence for Czech filmmaking official these films or no?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was the influence of these films. Like, yeah, always the question of influence is very tricky, but you can see some resemblances, like stylistic mostly, between these films and the fictional ones. But I would say more that these films were taken inspiration or stylistic features from the Czechoslovak fictional filmmaking, although the authors were not the same. Yeah, these sci-fi films with Augusta coming to Kospol from Author Space, it again like could resemble Visitors from Polak or other kinds of resemblances. What I found also interesting was, because I was researching more on the Škoda as well, and you can find because for the 1970s, it's a very specific kind of knowledge I gained last month, is that there was the most important selling point for Škoda in the 70s was safety. It was because of very important context of the whole world trade with cars, but they used crash tests as a part of their publicity. And if you look into the Czechoslovak fictional cinema, there are an unprecedented wave of films with cars, motoring, like Ferrat Vampire, for example, where they used Škoda cars, for example, in a very specific, again, very freak way. So it's somehow like it's not an, I wouldn't say influence, but some like connections of the milieu of the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a good thing you're bringing this up, because I thought about another theme that we come across both in the fiction film and in the film you've mentioned, is all sorts of espionage, industrial espionage, the Cold War fear and paranoia, and
it's
same with
there,
Paris,
but
because
you can't say who influenced whom, obviously, but it's there
just in the air.
Yeah, in the air. Yeah, exactly.
Weirdly enough, actually, an observation from my own topic, because I work on the references during the same period. I work on the references to Western pop cultures and all sorts of Western material culture. So in fiction films and like long fiction films, you've mentioned, for example, scenes at bars that feature exclusively Becherovka, and in my corpus, in my experience, those are always bottles of Cinzano or Martini that are just available to any Czechoslovak bar goer freely. And actually, you have this huge filmography that is doing exactly the opposite.
Yeah, exactly, because they're trying to sell the Eastern alcohol.
And this is quite interesting, because I was thinking about where there examples in feature films. Would you, maybe like off the top of your head, but it's kind of difficult, would you remember any kind of what we call the product placement that would overlap from public relation films into feature films?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I remember what you said, that you can say that even specific characters can be characterized through what they are drinking in the film, because they are drinking these cognacs and Cinzanos and so on, as some bourgeois, connected to some bourgeois values of the Western type. while like Czech people would drink beer. Obviously.
Yeah, in
Like,
Adela, they're drinking beer as this kind of like marketing ploy. They're
Yes.
the scene is so long. Yes, it's clear, like they know it's festival material, this film they're making, and they're like, yes, they're doing it very hard. Yeah. Yeah, but otherwise, yeah, Beharovka, I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember either, like whether there is some fictional film with Becherovka.
Yeah, maybe some crystal. No, actually, the films you mentioned with the crystal, like the slaw, the glass industry. Yeah, this is quite interesting as well, and how it ties into this idea of luxury and
Yeah, exactly.
consumer culture, which we have paradoxically during the normalization as well. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting for me is that this kind of representation of products is quite traditional for advertising, even from the 1930s onwards. Like you are displaying and exhibiting the specific artistic features of the glass itself. But it found out again some very specific luxury vibe in the 1970s, where they actually get rid, because the films of the 1960s, for example, the ones did by Richman, for example, they always include some reference to how these things are made. So you see the glass making itself, the industrial background. But in the 70s, it took up into like really essayistic film just about these products, about how you can film them, and how can you arrange them and display them. So it's the connection with the industry is done, and you just have the experience and the sensations of the glass.
Yes, just pure symbolism and pure just abstraction.
Yeah.
Do we have the last question? Yes.
I have another question about gender norms, because I had the impression that they are highly respected, that the salesman is a man, and other figures are gendered, like doing traditional gender roles. Is it the case?
It is. In this case, you are right. Like the sales representatives are like solely men. I'm thinking about, it's the same with in effect, I would say that the Czechoslovak advertising was not that gendered stereotyped as Western advertising of that time, but with these kinds of films, it really cope up with all those stereotypes. Because, for example, I remember now one of the public relations films for Centrotex, which was the textile company, and you can see their woman only as a model, and then people trading the textile, men trading the textile. So it's really very stereotypical. But in other cases, it was not that stereotypical as Western advertising, I would say, because sometimes. It was not so focused on even like a woman as a consumer, for example, not telling her about her gender roles, for example, as a household woman, for example. And from my knowledge, these films or these kinds of representations were more to be for the export again, like for the internal representation. This didn't work that much, because I wrote actually the article about the woman body in Czechoslovak advertising, and my argument was that there were some ideological barriers in representation of women in Czechoslovak advertising for the internal market, that they were not showing her as an object actually. And some advertisements even like were reflexive enough about this. So I call it the fragments of the body, because you always see that the woman is not there as an object of a male's gaze, which is typical thing of advertising, or she is not even in the roles of typical roles of advertising. So the strategy was not that explicit as in the Western advertising for some ideological reasons, because in the socialist advertising should not even and you can also see it in for example, representation of well-known figures. We don't even know a lot. We know that Shoberová did some advertisements. Olga Shoberová was the model of the 1960s. But mostly not, there are some, but it's the exception actually. They wouldn't allow a Czech pop singer or Czech actress to be a part of the advertising because of the idea that, this advertising shouldn't create some role models, for example. So this, and build envy, for example, in because she's too much beautiful and so on. So these kinds of restraints, like more or less ideological, connected to what socialist advertising should be, that it should be more educational and less, again, like selling in the hard terms of advertising, resulted in these kinds of specific representations. But for the foreign trade, they know how to do it in a Western way, I would say.
Yeah, because I was
Pragmatically, basically.
I was surprised you mentioned fashion shows, and the trope of fashion show is quite taboo in, I think, across the state socialist territory.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But I saw some fashion show films for Central Text, basically. Yeah. From the 70s, basically. Yes.
Thank you, Lucie, so much. It was so much fun.